Kurt, can you square up a little bit more towards the camera, your body?
The other way.
The other way.
Yeah.
There you go.
I'm Kurt Goldschmidt, and I was born in Hamburg, Germany on the 30th of March 1923. My father owned a very large store where they sold garments and beddings. And he was married to his First World War child girlfriend, Helene Goldschmidt, Helene Nagel. She was Aryan, I mean Christian. My father came from a very Jewish family, but he was not observant at all. So later on we were not observing the Jewish religion at all.
What was your community like?
The community we lived in was about the worst part of Hamburg. It's called the Reeperbahn, an entertainment district like the Times Square here in New York. And we moved when I was 5 or 6 years old from there into a very, very high-class neighborhood, into a large corner house that had apartments. We stayed there until 1933. Then Hitler came and we had a little problem already. We had 3 stores in the meantime, and 2 of them had been closed in 1934. The third one we kept open because an aunt of mine had became part owner of it, and she was Dutch by marriage. So we had that store open until about 1937 or 38. Then we also had to close that store. And in the meantime, we had moved from this wonderful apartment to an area that's called Hamm in Hamburg, and it was also an apartment house, no elevators, of course. Oh, the reason we left the Hochallee, the big apartment, was because they installed elevators and the rent became much higher. So we lived in Hamm and had this one store still in the Fuhlsbüttlerstraße in Barmbek, but we also had to close that in 1938 or so.
So you had a very secular upbringing. Your father was Jewish and your mother was not Jewish.
Yeah.
And you didn't grow up in a Jewish community per se. Did people know when you were a boy? Did people know you were half Jewish or Jewish at all?
Yes, some people knew. Some of my friends, on the street friends, knew that I was Jewish or something like that. They did not make much difference about it, whether I was half Jewish or Jewish.
When did you first start experiencing anti-Semitism?
It was in 1938 that we were sitting on the stoop on the street, about 5, 6 friends of mine, when 2 other fellows came in. One of them had the Hitler Youth uniform on. They were brothers. And he said good hello to everybody, but not to me. And when I stretched out my arm, he said, "What are you still doing here? You belong to Palestine." That was the first time somebody argued with me. And we had a kind of a fist fight right now. And as Amen, the stormtrooper came across the street and said, "Stop this, stop this. He's a Jew. That doesn't matter. In uniform, you don't struggle here." Okay. So he rescued me from this much taller and stronger fellow. Then I went upstairs to my house and never went onto the street again to play with my friends, except one who invited me to come to his house.
Do you remember Nazi propaganda, anti-Jewish propaganda? Do you remember the moment where you might have realized that the Nazi regime was posing a danger to you and your family?
Yes, I realized that when SA troops and SS troops marched in front of our house, because on the next corner there was a restaurant which they used as a meeting point. And I remember singing them, and wenn das Judenblut vom Messer spritzt, dann geht's nochmal so gut. If the Jewish blood runs from the knife, it is even get better.
And then, so what was the feeling in your family? What were you talking about in terms of your worries or?
Well, we were worried already because we had to close the stores and had only this one store left. And we struggled kind of financially. I had a sister. That was interesting. My sister worked for a Jewish company like I did as an apprentice. And in 1938, these Jewish stores Jewish businesses were closed. They had to be taken over by an Aryan person. The Aryan person who took over my sister's company, or where she worked, wanted her to stay. But since she was a Mischling, like me, and we did belong to the Jewish community, we were considered by the Nuremberg laws to be like full Jewish persons. Hitler didn't like these mixed persons, so he got rid of some of them by making them full Jewish this way. My sister was taken out of the Jewish community by a high-ranking Nazi and was from that point on a mixed person first grade, while I became a Jewish person's equalized to a Jewish person. I had to wear a star. My father did not have to wear a star, so he was Jewish, because he was married to an Aryan person. It was a very unusual situation. When I walked out into the streets with a star, I always had a map in front of it. I didn't want it to show.
And what date did you start having to wear? What was the date that you started having to wear the Jewish star?
In 1938, I believe.
And what do you remember of Kristallnacht?
I was working as an apprentice in an import company, Frankfurter and Liebermann, which was a Jewish company. And one day, the principal of the company, who was very well known at the Börse, at the stock exchange, came home from the stock exchange and was crying. The second person in charge of the company went into his office, and I overheard that he was told he should never come again into the Chamber of Trade. What was your question?
What you remember of Kristallnacht?
Okay. Shortly after that, we had the Kristallnacht. I went to work in the morning at Frankfurt and Liebermann and came by stores like Robinson, a big, very famous clothing store of higher grades clothing, which was damaged. The windows were all broken in. The people ran in and out, stealing the goods. And I came to my office, and I was told, go home. We have a big problem here. There is no more company. The company was taken over by the next person who was an Aryan person in the firm. And they kept it going. And she told me after the war that she wanted to give it back to the person that owned the company. However, he had died in the meantime. That was Kristallnacht. I went home. My father was not arrested. So many Jewish people were, because we lived in a neighborhood where there are very few Jewish people living.
And then you had no more stores at that point for them to
At that point, we had no more stores at all.
Otherwise, they would have probably set it on fire, or?
Not necessary, because it was owned by a Dutch woman, so to speak, as I said before, and it was protected. But the propaganda that was taking place before, and the SA men marching in front of it, don't buy a Jew and so far, had resulted in that very few people still came to the store, and we had to close it.
What was your mother thinking about this anti-Semitism? She's married to a Jewish man. What was her reaction to all this?
My mother actually was, at marriage, became a Jew, so to speak, went to this bath ritual and so far, mikvah, it's right, and so far. And she held on to my father, so she was called once by the Gestapo and told that she could get a divorce free of charge to get rid of this Jew. She said, no, I stay with him. She was never bothered by the Gestapo after that anymore.
Did she look like the ideal German Aryan that Hitler,
Yes, actually,
for?
she looked like a Hamburger, a person living in Hamburg. She came from a family who were seafarers who had a fishing boat. And yeah, that was it. As I said, my sister was called half Aryan and worked there at that company.
Okay.
Well, I had to wear the star.
And,
So I decided that I would have to immigrate. And in order to immigrate, you had to have a certain profession to be accepted in England, for instance. That was a locksmith. The Jewish community had organized a locksmith course, also a course for carpenters. I joined the locksmith course and was there about almost a year. We had to file for a month on one piece of iron to make it very straight. It was a very unusual course, in my opinion. And then we had to learn how to hammer iron, etc., and being a smith.
and what date was this?
This was in 1938, 1939. Then the war broke out. And all these young people who learned in the school were sent to the east of Germany to help in the harvest, because so many people were taken into the army that they needed help there. This was also arranged by the Gestapo, and we went out to the east, to Dolgelin was the name of the little town, and worked in the fields. I was digging for potatoes, but I was not very good at it, and the man who I worked for was very kind and took me off that job and gave me a job to handle the horses, which I wasn't very good with neither.
You were a city boy.
I was a city boy, exactly, and therefore this country work was not for me. It took about 4 weeks or so. Then we went back to the school, but the school was in the meantime taken over by a company who made war material, and we had to move into another area. But after another month or two, we were told the school has to be closed by the Gestapo. And I was sent to work for a war industry company, a small company. A company had about 10 workers, and about 4 to 6 Jewish workers who came in addition. And we did the parts for the marine.
Boats? Engines?
Not. We had to make the chain, a part that connects various chains. A certain amount of chain had to be connected to each other.
Links?
To make a long.
Link?
Links.
Yeah.
Links, yes. Links, this might be the right word. We had to
And
make.
what was happening to your parents while you were having all this industrial training? What was happening with your other family?
My mother.
After the war started.
Yeah, my mother did homework for other people, cleaned houses, etc., just to give us a little income. And my father stayed home and took care of a baby that my sister had born shortly after she had a boyfriend. They could not marry. They could marry if they get a permission from the government. Half Jewish people could marry an Aryan person if they had a special permission. But these permissions were hardly ever given. So they did not even apply for it. Her boyfriend, let's say, called, was taken into the army and sent to the Russian front. He was later captured by the Russians and was imprisoned in Siberia for a year after the war, for 2 years or so.
What was your own feeling about feeling discriminated against and your own identity as a half-Jewish person? What was your feeling at the time? You were old enough maybe at that point to understand what organized hatred is and discrimination. What were you feeling?
Well, I felt very bad, of course. Had no more friends, except now met Jewish people, which I had never met before. And we had comparatively a good time together. One of my Jewish friends had a folding boat, and we took trips with this still until he was deported in 1939.
So tell us about your experience being deported.
Okay, my father died in 1939, I believe it was, in May or June, and I was called into a transport.
How did he die?
Oh, my father was called in by the Gestapo to work on the top of a warehouse on the harbor. On this warehouse, he had to lift goods with a crane, I think it's called.
Pulley.
A pulley. He worked there one day. It was on the waterfront. The goods came out of a boat from a chute up. And he worked there one day and caught a cold and was sent to the so-called Jewish hospital. The Jewish hospital, the real Jewish hospital, was already taken over by the army. This was in a villa that they had improvised as a hospital. He died one day later. That was 1930.
It was an industrial accident?
An industrial accident, kind of, yes.
But under Gestapo.
Under Gestapo, right?
Pressure.
Yes.
And when did you find out about this?
Well, when he was in that so-called Jewish hospital, he found out. He was buried in the cemetery of my grandparents, who were so-called Aryans, the Christian cemetery.
So
Now came the time when I was called to the transports to Russia. It was in October 8th, or was it November 8th? I'm not quite sure right now.
1939?
1939, can't remember now. It could be 1940 when the transport started. It could be 1939. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I was called into the Logen house where there over 1,000 people were. My mother came with me and pleaded with the Gestapo that I was only half Jewish and so far. In the meantime, my girlfriend, Jewish person, was also in this transport.
You were 16 years old?
I was 16 years old, yes. The Gestapo said that they would look into it and send me back home. Since my girlfriend was in this transport and all other friends of mine, I decided to go to the Jewish Community Center, who needed volunteers to help them out with this transport while I was still in Hamburg, which I did, and I said eventually goodbye to my girlfriend and the others at the Hannoverschen Bahnhof, on the railroad station that was called after the city of Hanover, where these transports left for Minsk. From 1,100 persons, 8 people came home. I went back home and had to go to the Gestapo, and he said they will investigate it. It was investigated in Berlin by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. That's all one word. And it took until 1943, when we were bombed out in our house. The whole street was bombed out and inflamed. Now, where used to be these houses is a park. When we were bombed out, and I left to various cities with my mother, I received through the mail, which was sent from one place to another until it reached me, because you had to report every time when you moved to the police department. It reached me, and a postcard said, "You have been declared as equal to full Jewish person." This card I burned, and I acted as if I never received it. I worked then at this factory again, which was also half bombed out, and we reconstructed it, made these iron parts for the Navy, and acted as if nothing happened. I lived in a half bombed out apartment house, which was only destroyed in the back, and in the front you could live. It was an apartment of a Christian aunt of mine, which had been evacuated to the countryside. One day, I got a call from the Gestapo, who was now in a villa that used to be the Jewish community's house. And I was told, didn't you hear from Berlin? I said, no, I haven't heard. And my mother wanted already to travel to Berlin to investigate why I haven't heard, and which wasn't true. And so far, but the trains were not available to take normal passengers anymore. So she couldn't get to Berlin. This was in 1944. The Gestapo man said, "You're not wearing a star." I said, "No, I'm half Jewish. I should not wear a star." He said, "No, you have to wear a star." So then I go to the Jewish community to get a star. Of course, I had one. I tried to make believe that I felt that I was half Jewish and not affected by the Judaism. He let me get home again. And then I got, after a few weeks, came a policeman onto the door, a real policeman. And he said, "Mr. Goldschmidt, you have to come to the police station. There's something with you being a Jew." He questioned. He said, "Okay." I went to the police station. The police station said, "I'm sorry, but you have to go to the Gestapo office. It's that street in Altona." I went to the Gestapo office. There was a man in uniform, SS uniform or Gestapo uniform, I don't remember. And he was very bad to me. "What are you doing still here, you Jew?" "I'm working for an armament factory, and I been needed there." "It's about time you're getting away out of the city." That was it, something like that. I went back home, and in December, I got the mail to report to the former boys' Jewish school. It's called the Talmud Torah School, which was already taken over by the Gestapo.
December of 1944.
1944, December.
Very late?
Very late. I went there. There were about 20 people. Most of them were mixed persons like me who were Jewish, or Jewish persons who were married to an Aryan person. We went on the train, regular personal train, to Berlin with 2 policemen in the compartment. There we went to the Jewish community house, which was adjacent to the synagogue, and former synagogue was not used as synagogue anymore in Berlin, and were joined by many, many other people. We were about 100 people the next day. At night, we heard already shooting from the Russians, cannon fire, and we hoped it would be all over soon. But we were sent to a railroad station, got into a car, also a passenger car, about over 100 people. The whole car was for us. We were sitting there. The Gestapo came and came again and again and counted and counted and counted. Something was wrong. In my compartment were 2 fellows who had been already in Theresienstadt and had escaped when they were on a transport out of Theresienstadt, were caught in Berlin and now put back into this car. The Gestapo finally thought the account was right, and we left. Next to me was a woman who said, where are we going? He said, I believe to Theresienstadt. Oh, it's called now Theresien, it's in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech area. And she said, what are we doing there? Well, where is it? I said, you haven't heard of Theresienstadt? He said, no. So I don't understand. As a Jewish person, everybody knows Theresienstadt. It's like a ghetto. He said, yeah, I'm not Jewish. I don't know. He said, you're not Jewish. How come? Well, I'm a refugee from East Prussia, where the Russians came, and I want to go to a place where it's safe. So I had to report this to the police, who was in the next compartment, about 6 policemen. And since I was assigned to be the head of the compartment, I had to report it to them. And she went over to them and had a good time drinking and having good times with the policemen. Then we arrived in Theresienstadt. The policeman came to us and said goodbye, and I hope you soon come back home again. They were definitely not Nazis. When we arrived, we were greeted with Gestapo and SS law people and their dogs, and also some Czech policemen. We were herded into a room, and for delousing, for getting rid of our lice or whatever, we had to undress, got our luggage, which we still had, taken away. We was going to get it later. After we were deliced, we were brought into a barrack. Theresienstadt was a very unusual camp. It was called a ghetto and not a concentration camp at that time. Theresienstadt was an old city surrounded by a wall and a moat and a water surrounding too. It was for...
What was conditions like in this?
Now I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So once we came out, we were put into a barrack, 3 beds on top of each other. I had the top bed. And the next day we had to do nothing. But we were told there is a cafe. We could have coffee and there's entertainment in the cafe. Yes, there was a cafe. It gave, we could get coffee and a piece of what they called cake. And the coffee, of course, was not real coffee. It was made out of corns, burnt corns. And there was actually an entertainment from another Jewish fellow who was a Danish person who had been brought in from Denmark. I met him later in Sweden again after the war. But this was only one day, and one of the shows that Theresienstadt had to offer. The next day, I was assigned to a workforce of maybe 40 to 60 people. I don't remember anymore how many, but we were 40 people and had to remove from the wall a piece about 10 feet wide and 20 feet high, to remove it so that could be used as a target for shooting. The Gestapo man who was in charge of the camp wanted to make this a shooting place for himself. After we had done this, he was released and a new Gestapo man came. A new Gestapo man came, and he said, "What is this?" Well, we had to remove this. He was making a shooting range of this. "Oh, put everything back." So we put everything back. After that, I could choose to get another work. And we had our own Arbeitsamt, work office, who assigned work. What do you call it?
Work placement?
Yeah, a work placement office. You have it here too. When you have no work, you're going here to a place that gives you work, assigns you to workplaces. Can't remember the English name right now. So this work assignment place, assigned me to the locksmith's shop. They had a locksmith's shop, was right next to where the Gestapo lived. And because of that, they had to cover the roof chimneys because the Gestapo didn't like the smell of the chimney coming into their area. Therefore, in the locksmith's place, it was a terrible stink of the smoke. I stayed there 2 days, but so it was indoors, and we got even a little more food, which was very important in Theresienstadt. I couldn't stand it, and I reported I would like another job. Now I got another job and less food. This job was about 60 to maybe 100 people worked on this. The surroundings, casemates, had holes in it where in former times people were shooting out or were supposed to shoot out if they would have been encircled by an enemy. These little openings we had to close up with cement and bricks in order to make this an air raid shelter. I worked on that about 2 weeks when somebody said, "You know, I think they're building a gas chamber here. We are building a gas chamber." "What are you talking about? This is unbelievable what you're talking." "Yes, I think they will gas us in here." Nobody believed this, what this person said.
When was that? January 45?
That was about in February already, February 45. What came then? The worst part at that time was that we got less and less food. One day, the food was better because the Swiss Red Cross came the next day and inspected the camp. I was, in the meantime, sent to another area of the camp where we dug into the ground to make shelters where you could shoot out from if the enemy would attack us.
Pillbox? A pillbox?
A pillbox, you might call it, yeah. That's the right word. The Gestapo, that was a day when the Red Cross people were there. The Gestapo came with a Red Cross man and showed what we were doing to protect us, protect them too. And I wanted to say something. I don't remember what. He said, "You be quiet," said the Gestapo man. So we could not talk to the Red Cross people. The Red Cross was gone, and so was the better food. It got worse and worse. One day, we saw smoke at the SS accommodations coming up. They were burning papers. We saw papers coming up, flying up into the air in the flames. And we heard the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. That's good.
So were they hiding evidence?
They were hiding evidence, they were burning the evidence, all evidence. And eventually, without that we knew, they flew, they ran away. We didn't know yet, and then the Russians came, and we were liberated. The Russians looked worse than us. They were torn, the uniforms were all torn, except the ones from the officer. They looked in terrible condition, and we were told to stay inside for at least 2 days. The Russians took positions. In the meantime, we got transports that were probably on the way to Auschwitz, and Auschwitz could not reach, was already conquered by the Russians, and they were sent into our camp. They were in terrible condition, these people. They had sicknesses. I can't remember the name right now.
Typhoid?
Typhoid and others. And they were sent into one section of the camp that was the outer front. There was a small section of the camp which was a little bit outside and only connected over water with a bridge.
This was March 45?
This was March 45. It was already the end of March, April perhaps already. I think it was April. The war was still going on in the western part of Germany.
The Americans were coming through.
The Americans were already nearby, but not in our area that was Russian occupied, and the British were in Hamburg.
What happened next?
What happened next?
You interviewed your mother?
Yeah.
Another family?
Yeah, I had
And your eventual...
Yeah, my mother had gone to some relatives that lived in the country about 20 miles away from the city of Hamburg, which was very quiet on the main street to the city of Kiel. And
they didn't bother her anymore?
They didn't bother her at all, no.
Now that her husband was deceased and her,
exactly.
And her half-Jewish sons were
right.
taken.
And when we had left Hamburg, after the bombardment in 1943, my sister and her boy went to Posen in Poland, which was occupied, where her boyfriend's parents had flown to, and she lived there until the Russians came close to them, and then came also back to this small town near Hamburg to my mother's house, where my mother lived. In the meantime, back to Theresienstadt. The Russians were there, and we could go out and waited for transports to get home. The first transport went home was the Czech people, the Czech Jewish people they had already left on foot, many of them, and the others were transported back to Prague and Bratislava and wherever they came from. Then came transports to Berlin and to Cologne and to Stuttgart and other cities, and finally 6 trucks and 1 bus came from Hamburg to pick Hamburgers up. Hamburg and people who lived in the area of Hamburg. Transport home, I decided to go on one of the trucks that was full of the merchandise and whatever we had in the meantime gathered in the camp. And we went for 3 days from Theresienstadt to Hamburg. When we arrived in Hamburg, we were brought to the Jewish Community Center, which was the former Gestapo house, where I had been before at the Gestapo, and were assigned to accommodations. The accommodations I got were very bad. I was assigned with my mother to live in an apartment. It was on the ground floor in the backyard of a completely destroyed area. This house was still intact, and one old elderly couple, must have been 60, 70 years old, lived there already. We had to share the 2.5 rooms and kitchen with these people. Water was only 1 faucet in the kitchen. There was a toilet, and there was also water in the toilet to flush, but otherwise there was no other water in this apartment. That was what the after Nazi were able to give people who came from concentration camps.
And when did you realize or find out that the war had, that Germany, the Nazis had finally been defeated? And
well, when I was in Hamburg back,
yep.
It was already the end of the war. In fact, the Nazis actually, I think, gave up in end of March already.
Maybe a little later.
Or a little later, maybe. Yeah. But we came in later home. Now, what shall I do?
Let's talk about post-war life. When did you come to the United States?
Okay.
Your other members of your family, and then we'll spend a short amount of time reflecting on your experience.
Of the States.
Yeah. So, when did you and your mother decide? Did your mother come? Yeah. Okay. You'll tell us.
So we lived in this terrible condition there, and I got acquainted with a youth organization that was found. Before, there was only the Hitler Youth, where everybody in a certain age had to be in. Here was a new youth organization formed, the Free German Youth Company. And I joined them and became very active in them. In the meantime, I was suggested to become a social worker and went to a school of social work. After about a year at the School of Social Work, which was interrupted by practicum at the government of Hamburg, where I met many Nazis, which were still there. After the 2 years there, I was finished with the study. I had the opportunity to go to Sweden, through the social work school of Malmö, Sweden. They were asking us if we would come to work in Sweden for a month or so. and I volunteered with 3-4 other people of the school. I worked in Malmö in a shipyard as a helper. I didn't do much work because I didn't know anything about shipbuilding, of course. But other people were there from Poland that were very good workers. After a month where I had still time in Sweden on my own, I went to Malmö, to Stockholm, where I met a former friend of Hamburg who had been in very many concentration camps and had been originally at that transport to Minsk, which I mentioned before. He was eventually liberated in Bergen-Belsen and sent with a Swedish transport to Sweden to recuperate. We were 2 weeks together there, and then I went back home to Hamburg. I got a job with the youth department of the welfare department in Hamburg, the city. A very good job. However, I didn't like the way the Hamburgers were on all the people in Germany. We had a chancellor, Mr. Adenauer. He was not an anti-Nazi. He was not a Nazi neither, but he did not do anything against the Nazis that were still in power. And I decided to come to America, which was very easy to come by, because the UNRWA had arranged a transportation of so-called displaced persons who had been in concentration camps in Germany to America. We went on a troop transporter who had sent troops to Bremen, which was an enclave of Americans in the British zone, and went to a troop transport ship to America. Again, I was sitting on the 3rd floor of a 3-bedded room, but this one was wonderful, and the food was excellent, which we had to take in standing, like the soldiers apparently had in the basement of the ship. We arrived in America and saw the Statue of Liberty. Relatives of mine from the Jewish part of my family had already established themselves just before and during the war, where they had been in England sometimes, some of them, in America, and picked us up and went up to their home in Washington Heights, which was called Frankfurt on the Hudson, because so many Jewish people, German Jewish people, lived in this area, Washington Heights, at that time. We lived there for a week, and then they had obtained us an apartment, also in Washington Heights. The apartment was something that we thought was wonderful.
What year was that?
That was in 1948.
Did you become a social worker here in the United States?
Eventually. My first job was, my wife got a job, she was a dressmaker. Oh, I forgot her altogether. I married her in Germany while we were still in Germany.
Your girlfriend?
My girlfriend in Germany, yes. We married in Germany and came together. My mother also came with us. Actually, not with us a week before, but that doesn't matter.
Did your mother approve of your girlfriend?
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. And we all three lived in this one apartment, which had only one living room, one bedroom, and a kitchen, and a beautiful bathroom with a tub and everything, and hot water. This was unheard of for us at that time. So we lived in Washington Heights, and my wife right away got a job on Madison Avenue as a dressmaker in a very fine establishment there, in a retail store. I got a job a few days later as a dishwasher, part-time, from 1 to 3 o'clock in a restaurant chain called Bressrail. They don't exist anymore. But they had 4 or 5 stores, big restaurants in New York City, Manhattan. I took the subway, which was 5 cents. And I went to work every day. And afterwards, when I was finished with work, I went to the movies, which cost us about 10 cents or so. And saw a film twice. There were actually 2 films and a show on the stage. And I saw this twice in order to learn English, and learned pretty good. I also went at night to a school in our neighborhood in Washington Heights, where you were taught English. The next job I got through a cousin of mine, who was an interior decorator, was as office boy at the office of Russell Wright. Some people might know the name. He was a very famous modern designer in America. He had a house on 53rd Street, East Side, one of the houses there, and I came to him to work as an office boy. After I worked there for a year, he told me that he has no better job for me and I should do something better. He will look for another job for me. He found a job for me at a company that made lamps for the house. It was a competition of a firm that everybody knows here, apparently, Lightolier, but this was a competition, Remo. At that time, they were not as big as Lightolier, but they were very famous already. I was assigned to be the assistant to the manager there. The office, the factory and office was in Union City in New Jersey. I bought a car, a used car, a Chevrolet, and drove every day from Washington Heights to Jersey. We also had to pay a toll over the bridge. It was 10 cents.
Did you, don't tell me how much a Hershey bar was.
Hershey bar was 2 cents, I think.
I think I just paid $1.50. And you eventually had children?
Eventually, we got one daughter. She was born in the Bronx, in the hospital, and we moved into a larger apartment in the same building, upstairs, top apartment, that had 2 bedrooms, living room, and a balcony, and a kitchen, of course.
Did you ever talk about, did your mother or you, when did you start talking about the Holocaust or your experience to others and sharing your story? At what point did you?
That was much later, really. Nobody was interested at that time. I think only when we moved here to Bayside that I got involved in this, more or less.
And when you speak to students,
That was also in the last 10 years.
Yeah. Is there a message that you like to leave with students? Or is there a message you want people who are watching this video of your story, is there a message you have for them?
Well, I have only 2 words. Never again.
I think you know, there was always a little bit of resistance inside of you throughout this whole time during the war, from what I can hear, that you never just went along with what they were saying. There was a little bit of resistance, I feel. Maybe that was because you were from 2 different cultures, and you could see both sides, and you knew this was wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe the spirit of resistance a little bit.
What do you mean by the resistance?
Well, I think when you burned your card and you sort of disobeyed some of the Gestapo or police, there was I don't think you just forfeited yourself. I think you were always looking, it feels like wherever you were always finding a way to survive.
Yes, right. Yes, I did. It was a miracle that I survived this way. As if I would have gone onto this transport where my mother got me out, I would have not come back because of 1,100 people. 8 people came back.
What do you think about politics and with what you know about World War II history? What are your feelings now when you watch the news?
Well, I'm very shocked that the United States is involved in so many wars. Everywhere we had to go and kill other people. At the present president, I see another Hitler coming up. It's terrible. That's my opinion.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your story.
You're welcome.
We appreciate it. Perhaps, would you like to see what we saw on the camera?
That would be fine, yeah.
Okay.